is a real thing, the ADHD industrial complex, and it will sell you anything, you know, in the way that industrial complexes work. It offers you a solution for a price that often only reinforces the problem that it is purporting to solve. So many of those so-called solutions that so many people are happy to sell you, what ends up happening is they don't work. Inevitably, they stop working. And then they become just another site of shame and failure, which only reinforces all of the issues that you had at the beginning.
You are listening to Disorderland, your psychiatrist's least favorite podcast. Thank you so much to everyone for the great feedback we got on our first episode. We have many, many ideas and plans in the works, so I hope you will stick around, subscribe, and send this episode to your group chat. Sharing the podcast is the best and most free way to support us. Today, we have a great conversation for you with our friend Marta Rose, who runs a digital peer support group we love called Divergent Design Studios. We'll talk about Marta's journey from diagnosis to critical disability theory, how creativity research and design thinking can offer us alternatives to the pathologizing framework of executive function, and we'll also discuss the possibilities and the perils of community building on the internet. But first, Aisha and I discuss the sad mental state of the wealthiest countries in the world and do a little shit-talking about the updated DSM-5.
When we talked about everything from like time-blindedness to hyper-focus to forgetfulness or the lack of attention. I mean, these are pointing to innate ways of existing that are unnatural for everybody. And I feel like certain people just have a harder time adapting. But all of that, I really think, is a result of trauma and all of these several environmental variables that have gone into shaping their individual experience and how hard it's been for them specifically to conform to these systems. And that, I think, is a determinant for how much someone really struggles to conform versus someone else who has an easier time assimilating, but that doesn't mean that they actually like doing it or that is natural for human beings to do.
You are totally singing my song, Aisha. Like I like to say that neurotypical people suffer also under the regime of executive function and late capitalism and all of the rest of it, right? But they are just able, they are capable of conforming to those structures, not well and not happily and not with great mental health. And I think that for a lot of neurodivergent people, we're just literally not capable of it. And so it is just enormously traumatizing to us. And then, so, you know, we're just sort of natural designers, but we're forced to be executives. and that's really traumatic. And then what happens, this is the truly twisted part of it in my mind, is that the trauma of not fitting in actually creates most of the symptoms that then get labeled as being neurodivergent. Like, I'm not even convinced that most of the symptoms that we associate with neurodivergence are actually native to our brains and our neurology, but are actually the results of trauma. Yeah.
And shame. And I get it. I wish, and shame, which is like a very defining trauma trait.
Exactly.
Right?
I would say that shame is a form of trauma for sure.
So I really wish the worlds of like, just when we think of neurodivergence, we automatically think of like ADHD, autism, and then that could be bridged more with trauma. I think there is now much more awareness and general practice of understanding of social systems and a model of disability that includes understanding of capitalism and how it breaks us, I think, within the framework of trauma, just because you've had to step outside a little bit of the medical model to be able to think of trauma in a systems dynamic. But I wish that was applied more towards other forms of neurodivergence. I also am thinking the more levels of marginalization you have, there's just like more rocks on your back. And sometimes then that leads to, it is like capitalism to some extent since birth has put us into like fight or flight inevitably, right? Like we're never really guaranteed life and we're never guaranteed safety, security, and stability. So we always have a survival threat, which is capitalism that's ever present. And it is complex trauma to varying degrees to all of us that then spend our whole lives trying to earn the right to survive. And I think for people that have it worse, so the less resources that you have, that less access to resources you have, and the poorer that you are, And a lot of times, the more you are forced sometimes to do things that you absolutely do not want to do and can't do, but have to do to be able to like put food on the table. And I don't even think people think of that when it comes to quote unquote neurodivergence. It's like so much of it is socially constructed, and it also relies on you having access to a diagnosis and the healthcare system and certain models of it and all of that. Whereas so many other people don't even have that kind of luxury to think about themselves in that manner, and just have to do whatever it takes because this system is really forcing them into that level of survival response, I guess.
I agree entirely, completely. And I think that there's all kinds of twisted ways that capitalism, obviously, and white supremacy intersect, and and then intersect with the whole issue of neurodivergence. Absolutely.
And I think gatekeeping is interesting then if we think about labels, and when people, like we all talk about, like you can just, self-identify as whatever, and maybe that does something for you to be able to make sense of your experience in this world. But it's interesting because we get that a lot when we talk about different types of neurodivergence and capitalism, where we get like, oh, you should listen to this person because they have this diagnosis and whatnot. So it's like this, people have a tough time even recognizing that they're saying contradictory things. If they're saying that people can self-diagnose and identify with anything, and that this is a fluid experience, and then you're also gatekeeping based on who can and can't say what they can say based on what they identify as. And then we talk about access and how people don't even know that neurodivergence exists, and they might just think that, the experiences that they're having, they have to conform because that's the life they have. So it's like, none of this really makes any sense because it contradicts with each other.
Yep.
Well, sorry, going back to shame, because I think this is like really important to like break apart. Like, how do you think the effects of shame are being pathologized within these like diagnostic constructs?
I think that that shame almost always manifests as avoidance, or one of the many ways that shame will manifest is through, like, we avoid. Shame is just such a toxic experience and such a toxic emotion that we will avoid the things that make, I talk about shame, but you can really talk about shame and trauma almost interchangeably. Like, I think that shame is a trauma, so I think that shame can cause us to avoid things, which then looks like procrastination, looks like an inability to follow through on projects and assignments and tasks. I think that shame, just like any trauma, as Aisha was saying earlier, makes us emotionally reactive, makes us, triggers things that make us look like, we don't have any control over our emotional lives. Those are just a couple that come right off the top of my head as like classically understood to be neurodivergent traits that I think are actually rejection, the supposed rejection sensitivity. Even this new one that Barclay's coming up with that you have been having such fun with, Jess, the sluggish cognitive tempo. Right?
Oh, no. It's well, that's another thing he's trying to make into a disorder, but emotional dysregulation deficit. Yeah. I think is something that he's saying. It's like,
they're all
like, we have this natural deficit to like not manage our emotions.
Right. And what they're describing, every single one of them, is basically a trauma response. And the trauma is, and Dodson, with a completely straight-faced Dodson, who came up with the term rejection-sensitive dysphoria, he addressed the issue of trauma when he was, coming up with this, and insisted that no, it's not related to trauma because my clients haven't, who have this, haven't been traumatized. They don't have trauma in their lives. And I'm like, we have trauma,
which we all do,
from the moment we've taken our first breath. Like, trauma is just like the condition of existence. It's like an existential condition of existence of human life under late capitalism, especially if you are a person of color or a trans person or a neurodivergent person or a disabled person in any sort of way. Like,